I guess it's just about 1 o'clock, so we're going to get started. And I'd like to welcome everybody here today for our session on Crop Talk. Maybe just give you a little bit of background of what Crop Talk is. It's a weekly webinar that we do with Manitoba Agriculture, and it's usually held every Wednesday from 9 o'clock till 10 o'clock in the morning. And what we do is we talk about what things are going on in the field. So we have our specialists from Carmen that are on, and they're usually on a crop scouting panel that we have producers that'll have questions through the week. And we like to go over those questions and bring them out to everybody so they can see what's happening in the province as well as what's maybe happening in other provinces, so we can keep our eye on what's going on. So what we're going to do today is we're going to give you kind of a mini version of Crop Talk. We've got 3 presenters today. They're going to go over a few of the things that happened this past year, and then we're going to deal with some questions. So what we'll do first is I'm going to bring up our first speaker, and our first speaker today is going to be Sonia Wilson. And Sonia joined the Faculty of Agriculture at the University of Manitoba to complete her undergrad degree with a focus on plant biotechnology. She then worked on research projects focused on canola tolerance to excess moisture stress before covering the role of research manager for the Manitoba Canola Growers Association during a term leave. In January of this year, she began an exciting new role as the Manitoba Ag Oilseed Specialist and focused on supporting and advancing the oil sector in Manitoba. So with that, I'm going to bring up Sonia, and she's going to give us a little bit of what she experienced this past year in some of the oil seeds that we grow in Manitoba here.
Okay, thanks so much, Lionel. And I think I'm here instead of Anne because cereals did pretty well this year, but we all know we've got some questions on canola. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we saw, and let's head into it. Okay, so believe it or not, might be getting a couple questions about yield from this past season. So I wanted to take a look. This is a comparison from 2024, so our past growing season, to 2023. And I wanted to look at Manitoba and also Saskatchewan and Alberta, but focusing in here on Manitoba, we saw that our harvested acres actually did increase. So we were sitting a bit closer to the 3.3 million of what actually got harvested. But then really the story, right, goes into we had some yield challenges. We heard that across the board. And I'm pulling this from Ag Canada or Statistics Canada, hard to say. So it's a bit lower maybe than what we actually saw in the province, but whereas last year we had our record-breaking average yields in canola, this year we saw a lot more pressure, and it went down to about 37.1. So compared to last year, that's about a drop of 16%. And then of course that impacted, even though we had more acres that went in and were harvested, even with some of the moisture challenges, we saw our production as well decrease. And you're going to see why I wanted to compare against Saskatchewan and Alberta, of course different, but we saw that we were harder hit. And I think that a couple of those reasons being diseases here, as well as just some of the early weather that we saw. So I wanted to pull, put the kind of season in perspective. So I've pulled 2 moisture maps here. So this is your percent of normal precipitation, and I've pulled 2 timings. So the one on the left is May 1st to May 25th, and then May 1st to June 23rd. So this is really, I know a lot of some areas really had to push their seeding back with the moisture that we saw. Maybe it got broadcast and then harrowed in or even floated on. So I wanted to show kind of main kind of seeding dates that were going in, and even some of those extended. And what we see really, the picture was that this spring we had also good moisture reserves going into this spring, so on top of that, we had a lot of excess moisture. And that's where canola, especially with flea beetles and other challenges, that excess moisture on top really led to some stress symptoms and really presented some challenges, even just getting it in, right? And then we also talked through weed management, like getting back on to do a pass, just in these conditions was a challenge. So here's from the fields, right? When we have our excess moisture or that stress on canola, like what the impacts really are, main is that root system, because those roots, on the middle photo here, we want to see that taproot over the season, but when it's got that early stress, it's really going to do those adventitious or kind of lateral roots trying to get out of that stress. And that's where, some of the, the fertility that you're putting down, it can be hard. It's stress to get to that, especially early on. And I'm showing here as well some purpling, and you can see as well on the very right that adventitious roots or those lateral roots, just really trying to get out of the stress versus that taproot we would want to see. I think one of the other, I will touch on diseases in a bit, but one of the other kind of environmental things that we saw as well, and it's not new, but we see it stressing canola, is the days above 28 degrees. So here I pulled, this is a map, and it's not a map showing successive days of above 28 degrees, but just how many days in the period from May 1st to July 28th, so including those main flowering times, when did we get above 28 degrees? And why that's important is because this is right when you're flowering and you might have that pod abortion, especially if there's successive days above 28 and we don't get those relief temperatures overnight. And so you can see here just regionally where it was really affected, really in that central region. The legend here being if it's white, 9 to 12 days, hit 28 degrees and above. If it's kind of that lighter orange, 12 to 15, and if it's that really red area, it's over 15 days in that period. And so, just like anecdotally heading into the field, some fields that I went into, you could even track just on your stems there. You could see there's pods, and then there is successive days of 28 went in. Some of those pods aborted, and then again we went back to lower temperatures and pods came out again. So this is another thing that we really saw over this past season, and we're actually trying to work on just doing a bit more modeling to see in terms of successive days what impact that had on yield. So why, now this is the question, Lionel kept getting through crop talk, I also kept getting, so I thought it would be good to just put it in a slide, kind of in my opinion, what were some of the reasons that our canola yields were below. So as I mentioned, that excess moisture stress, that effect on root development, seeing those high heat days in July during flowering, and then also a lot of the disease pressures. So the next kind of question that's been coming in a lot, and here we're moving more into disease, is that we saw a lot of blackleg and we saw a lot of verticillium stripe, and also sclerotinia, which I'll get to in a little bit. But going out into the field, verticillium is this word, right, that we're hearing a lot. It's a disease pressure, especially here in Manitoba, that we're hearing a lot. This is a soil-borne disease, and our disease survey results, are showing that it's across potentially 60% of Manitoba. Now, the issue with our disease survey is that when we go into the field, so we're doing all of Manitoba and taking a look during the year to see what diseases are in the fields, we're going at a timing where verticillium hasn't fully developed and is at its full height. So our 60%, our at 60% of fields, honestly is probably a bit low, and it's probably could be even higher. But when you're heading into the fields, when you're going in, let's say you're doing, a post-harvest or even after-harvest scout, I want to put together, and this is pulled, I should say, from Canola Watch, from a really great article, and I've just kind of adapted it just to focus here on blackleg and verticillium. But what are some of the things that you are going to be looking for and to give an idea of how much blackleg you might have, right? And you're thinking about that residue for potential fields coming up, but then also to have an idea of how much verticillium you might have. So here I want to also put in gray stem, because we've also seen, I've had some photos sent to me that were actually gray stem and not blackleg or verticillium. So a couple key things to look for. So in terms of stem symptoms, right, if you're looking at your plants and blackleg, you're going to see pycnidia, or like larger black dots, and these are going to be closer to the base of your stem, so they're larger there. And as well, you might have stem lesions developed. In some areas that had hail damage, when I went into the fields this year, you could actually see they already had blackleg infection, but then that blackleg came out of it really stained out of the hail damaged areas. Verticillium stripe, early on that have that distinctive striping, right? It's pretty obvious to see. And then also later shredding and microsclerotia. Now your microsclerotia are moving up, further up the stem. So if you have a stem that has both blackleg and verticillium infection, most likely those blackleg pycnidia are gonna be lower on the stem, and the verticillium are gonna be higher. And then gray stem, it's a purple to gray kind of speckled stem. Now in terms of hitting the pods and what you would see, this is where you can kind of rule out gray stem, that it's gray stem versus blackleg or verticillium, because gray stem is the only one that will have evidence on the pods. Now if you're doing a cross section, and that's what we highly recommend, especially like like 60% seed color change, you head into your field, pull up plants, just do a cross section to see, and that's where you're going to do your blackleg ratings. Canola Council has a great 1 to 5 scale, and kind of if you take an average of those cross sections for how much blackleg you have, kind of each time you move up on the scale, let's say a 1, that's estimating about 17% yield loss potentially. So then you can kind of take a look to see for that field and have some potential yield modeling. Now the cross section here for blackleg, it's going to be more pie-shaped and really have that black pigmentation, versus verticillium stripes on your cross section is going to be kind of more gray and discolored. Can be hard because sometimes we see a bit of both, but that's your major differentiation there. And then scouting tips, like I said, prior to harvest, 60% seed color change, but it's not too late. If you've gone and harvested and you've got stubble still in your field, right, like you can pull that out and take a look. I highly recommend doing that. And then, yeah, I touched on the yield loss, and probably the elephant, right, is that at this point, verticillium has a lot of questions being asked about it. We know it's here, we know it's everywhere. What are the effects in yield? And we're just not sure at this point. A lot of dollars are going into research on it, and hopefully some of those questions are going to be answered in the next couple of years here. So here's just some photos I pulled from the field. So this is going to show your blackleg pycnidia. The base is at the kind of top, so you can see there. And then I wanted to pull and show, this is a difference of those cross sections like I talked about. So you can see your verticillium kind of more overall, the whole cross section, and grayer, versus blacklegs, that more black and pie-shaped, versus a healthy stem, which we want to see. And this is just the co-infection, or having both blackleg and verticillium on a stem. Sorry, I'll go back. And I should have a acknowledgement here. This is out of a research paper that was published in 2024, looking at how verticillium and blackleg actually interact together. And you can see here the blackleg, this is the bottom of the stem, has the larger pycnidia, right, which is very obvious, versus verticillium having the smaller and having moved up further up the stem. So then we got the question, and I'm just gonna go pretty quickly through this to give the other specialists time. But we got the question of what diseases are having the most impact on yield. So why does it seem to be more of a problem in Manitoba? And I would just refer back to those moisture maps. We got a ton of moisture this year, and especially sclerotinia, you see it really following those moisture trends. So when we had, 2021 was a really big drought year, and we basically saw 0% prevalence of sclerotinia versus this year, right? It really made a difference if you went in and made those spray decisions because of the moisture. So I would say if, fungicide protection wasn't on this year, that would be potentially a lot of yield was lost from that. As well as blackleg, we saw it being very prevalent as well. And then verticillium, and again, this is kind of the unknown because we know it's stealing yield, we're just not sure how much at this point. So this is the survey results from this year. So we go and do 130 fields across all of Manitoba and go to every RM that's producing canola. And this is, I put out by region. So you have Central, Eastern Interlake, Northwest, Southwest, and then you can compare that to the Manitoban average here. And I've just pulled out for the kind of top 3 ones that I just mentioned. So blackleg, sclerotinia stem rot, and verticillium strike. So depending what region you're from, you can take a look as well. And then this is, I just wanted to pull kind of the past 5 years. So here, prevalence, right, is the number of fields that had that disease, and then incidence is in those fields, how many plants had the disease. And so we can see here, let's look at sclerotinia first, sclerotinia prevalence. So it's that green. We can see it being very low in years like 2021 that had very little moisture, and a lot higher right in 2022 and then this year 2024 because of that moisture. But then we can also take a look at blackleg and verticillium, and we can see especially that verticillium really creeping up after we've started surveying for it in the past 5 years here. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to another specialist. I know we'll have some more questions at the end, but I will also be around after if you have more.
We're going to see if right now if there's maybe 1 or 2 questions for Sonia, we can take them right now, but we will have some time at the end. And any questions for Sonia right now? One question that I was getting a lot throughout the growing season is there anything we can do for verticillium wilt? If we see it, like for sclerotinia, we're looking at spraying. Is there something there now, or is there something in the works?
Yeah, and that's a good question. So right now, right, you have no chem option. I'll move over. Right, you have no chem option. You really don't have any genetics options right now in terms of disease resistance packages. So really, I guess I don't have the best answer at this point. I think it's really key to know if it's there or not and to know what level it is in your fields. Like I'd say that's the starting point right now, to have an awareness and know, again, like I said, it's soil borne. And so part of the questions are as we move into straight cut canola and it's being left on the field longer and that's giving more time for verticillium, is that a potential connection that's led to having higher levels across, our soils here in Manitoba? So I think we're really honestly waiting on a lot of the research to come out, and for seed companies, chem companies as well. I know they're doing a lot of research and it's being pushed industry-wide because it's really acknowledged as a key challenge right now.
Okay, and just one other question, is varieties any difference? For
so at this moment, we don't have any options yet for verticillium.
Okay, thanks, Sonia, and we'll be giving you some more questions a little bit later. So our next presenter is going to be Dennis Lange. Dennis is our pulse and soybean specialist for the province, and Dennis has been with the department since 2011 and has been involved in pulse and soybean industry for probably as many years as I can ever remember, but it's at least 27 years. And he's been involved with soybeans, peas, dry beans, and various other pulses. Dennis is also known to a lot of people for being Mr. Hawaiian, and he's got quite the collection of Hawaiian shirts, and I think he's up to well over 200 now. So let's invite Dennis to give us some update.
Yeah, thanks, Lionel. So, soybeans in Manitoba. I was thinking about this earlier today, and when we first started talking about growing soybeans in Manitoba back in early 2000s, we only had 20,000 acres. I was in private industry at the time, and the talk at the time was that, well, this is the third time soybeans have come into Manitoba. Is this going to be the winner? So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the challenges that we've seen over the years, some of the successes moving forward. And I encourage any questions as we go. This was my farm on July 1st. This was my enlist soybeans that I decided to grow this year. And you can see here, lots of water. And one of the successes with growing soybeans in Manitoba is when you get a crop established, soybeans can take a lot of moisture. The key here, though, is these were enlist beans. I chose this version of this type of bean because I wanted really good weed control right from the start. And that's really important when you're growing soybeans. That's one of the things you really need to focus on in soybeans now, especially with all the resistant weed issues that we're starting to see. This field, though, I was pretty discouraged by the end of the day on Canada Day. And thought, well, we'll see. It's a longer season variety. I farm down in southern Manitoba. In the end, this field did over 50 bushels, which was pretty amazing, actually. Now, with that being said, if this rain would have came after seeding, when the crop wasn't established, the yield wasn't there. As it was in 2016, we had a similar situation in 2016. Lots of rain right after seeding. Crop wasn't established. Yields, even though the provincial yield that year was 42 bushels an acre, our particular RM, we only were at 27 and my field was at 13. So soybeans do have their limitations. So just want to see if this is my pointer here. Oh yeah, okay, here we go. There we go. Okay, so estimated yield for 2024 is 45 bushels an acre. That's our estimated yield going forward. There's been some really good soybean yields in the Red River Valley this year. And our 10-year average, not including this year, is 36. 5-year average is 35. You can see here with go back a slide here. Over the years, when we first started, 20,000 acres. Yields have been up and down. 2004, we had frost in that particular year, so the yields were quite poor. 2022, yields were quite strong in 2022, that we had 45, so we actually tied a record this year. That's if that number holds true, but that's what the estimated yield moving forward is going to be for this year. So, as part of my talk today, and the question I always get from growers is that, how can we maximize our yield? How can we get more yield of what we're growing? So it's kind of a multi-stage, multi-stage project when you're looking at that. The first thing we're going to look at, though, is soybean varieties and how they differ in yields in different regions. So this is a map of Manitoba, and I break up the province into eastern and what I call western Manitoba. So eastern would be anything from Morden to Portage and everything to the Canada-U.S. border. The green area is the rest of the province. So when you look at the percent of acres of soybeans in those areas, back in 2011, we only had 5% of our soybean acres in western Manitoba. 95% were in the valley, Red River Valley. As time progressed, 2016, we were at 50%, pretty much an even split between the two areas. When you look at 2017, we were actually looking at, where's my 20? There we go, 2017. Western, we were actually looking at 53% of the acres in western Manitoba. Now we're actually sitting more at that 53% in the east and 47% in the west. Why is that important? Well, the reason I look at this information is I like to look at the yield differences between those regions. Because what that's telling me is if the yields are generally comparable between the regions, that means growers are picking varieties that are well suited for those regions. If you take a long season variety and put it in the western side of the province, it'll still grow, it'll still produce soybeans, but it won't produce its maximum yield. So when you go back a few years, look back in 2020, western area was 36, east was 38, pretty close. 21, west was 31, and east was 26. Why the difference in 21? Super dry year. Soybeans like moisture in that July-August period. You look down the list, you look at 2023, there was a 35 to 40 bushel difference. West was higher, and this year we're looking at about 45 in the east and about 41 in the west. Again, good moisture at the right time really pushes those soybeans forward. What are some of the key things that we need to kind of focus on or kind of remember? Because I think sometimes we always try to cut costs where we can as producers. And sometimes one of the costs that farmers like to do is that, well, you know, I heard that we only need 140,000 plants to get a good crop. Well, oops, back one here. Stand establishment is really important. So ideally, whether you're row cropping or whether you're solid seeding, your stand should be somewhere between 140 to 160,000 plants per acre. That's what you're targeting. That's not what you're planting, no. Ideally, you want to be in that 180 to 200,000 to what you're planting those acres to end up with that 140 to 160. What ends up happening if you start at that planting rate, your population is going to be lower. There's going to be more challenges with weed control, and you don't necessarily maximize your yield potential. If you have a stand that's lower than 160, let's say you have some production problems, some dry seed issues, and the stand is lower, the beans will still yield well, but you can't maximize your yield potential. So stand establishment really important. Making sure you're targeting that 140 to 160 established. That's what's been determined, and ideally you're planting a little higher than that. So seed costs are seed costs. They are what they are. But if you don't have good seed and good stand establishment in the ground, that's going to hurt you in the long run. But what's also important is, I get this question all the time, is that, well, you know, when should we be doing that stand establishment? Well, typically 30 days after planting, once you get a good stand establishment, going out, getting yourself a 28.25-inch hula hoop. I have to tell a little story. This colleague of mine phoned me up one day. She sent me a picture, and she says, and there was a picture of her dad on the floor measuring the hula hoop. And the caption read, Dennis Lange said you needed a 28.25-inch hula hoop. So that's what he was doing. The reason we use that is because the multiplication factor is 10,000. So whatever you see in here, you multiply by 10,000 to get your plant stand. So if you want 140,000 plants, 14 plants, right? Now, in this particular instance here, the stand establishment here, we're only at 102,000 plants. So we're a little bit low in that particular area. Here, this is a little bit on the high side. Okay, 200,000 is what's being established here. Probably a little bit on the high side. Again, that 140 to 160 is the range you want to be in. Okay, what else is important? Well, variety selection, right? Looking at maturities, looking at varieties that have good IDC scores, looking at varieties that have soybean cyst nematode resistance, and choosing a variety that is appropriate for your area. And what I mean by that is when you look at this Manitoba soybean maturity map, zone map, you'll find this in Seed Manitoba, you'll find this in the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers Variety Guide. Anything in the try that again. Sometimes the way it goes. In this region here, that's your very early season region. It all corresponds to the varieties you can grow. Early season region is through here. Down below here, down where Emerson is, we can grow longer season varieties and still be able to maintain that yield potential. What does that mean? What does it look like when you're looking at a mid-season to a late-season variety? So a mid-season variety here, you have at 95% brown pod here. A late-season variety, this one was actually about 2 weeks later. It's one of the latest ones that we were growing. But you can still see here, this is in probably the second week of September. If you got a frost there, that's in trouble. You could be in trouble. Now, in this particular instance, September was really hot this year. I've never done soybean maturity ratings when it's been 30 degrees in September before. So things really moved along. But that's visually what 2 weeks can look like in a soybean stand. So when you're looking at the information in the guide, that's what that means. This is the market share, what farmers produce in Manitoba and what they grow every year. The red circles are the long season varieties in the top 10. The yellow is mid-season. The light green are the early season, and the yellow one, or the dark green one there, is a very early season in there. We've seen a little bit of a shift in the top 10 this past year. We've seen a few more longer season varieties in there. I like to look at this even as a producer, just to see what growers are producing. In this mix, what's also interesting, when you're looking at that mix, extend, 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 extend. So growers are getting that message that with the advent of resistant weed issues that we're having to deal with, we're gone are the days that we're only spraying Roundup on soybeans, right? We need to manage all these different systems. Now, the Enlist system is another good system you can incorporate into your farm to help control some of these problem weeds moving forward. There is still some just straight Roundup Ready beans grown in that rotation, or grown in Manitoba as well. But with that being said, if you're growing a bean that only is tolerant to Roundup, you're still going to have to add something in the spring. I think that's the best way to kind of manage some of these weed issues. But you can see here the percent of these acres have shifted a little bit. The one that was most popular a number of years ago is now in the mid-pack. And in the end, it's just another way of kind of looking at what farmers are growing moving forward. Lots of colors on here. I like colors, as you know. This is the Western soybean information from this year, the variety trials that Manitoba Pulse and soybean growers run. This is information that's published in Seed Manitoba. This is what I call the highlighter test. Okay, go through it real quick. Take your pink highlighter, you highlight your LSD. That stands for least significant difference. What those numbers indicate is that those numbers, any varieties that you compare, any two varieties, have to differ by that amount. So, for example, we use a check at S003R5X at 100%. Anything that's in green is statistically higher yielding than the check. Anything that's in orange is statistically lower yielding than the check. And when you do that for each site, because each site will have a different LSD based on the stats, what you'll see is a bit of a checkerboard pattern. If it's not highlighted, that's not a bad thing, because that tells me that anything that's not highlighted, that's the same yield as the check. Statistically, it's the same yield. Anything in the top portion is earlier than the check. Anything in the bottom portion is longer than the check. So it's a way of kind of looking at the information to say, well, you know, we'll pick this one here, for example. This one here, the B002A, it's an Enlist variety here. Of the 5 sites that are tested, 3 of them were equal to the check, but earlier maturing. One was slightly lower than the check. Then what I do is I go over to the long term and see how it does long term. 97% of the check, pretty good. But it's only 6 site years, so it's only been tested for 1 growing season. But it's a way of kind of, if you do this every year, you can really see trends in some of the varieties. A lot of times you'll see, you know, on a year when we have a little bit more growing season, a little bit more moisture, you'll see a few more of these in the mid-season category, or the lower portion of it here. When we go to the next slide, in the mid-season varieties here, we see a few more, especially at Hamiota here. We saw a number of varieties that are higher yielding than the check. But it's a way of kind of looking through it to say, well, you know, if I'm trying a new variety, how does it yield? And to show you a real statistical difference, that's how you use the stats. And then from there, you look at the long term. You know, is it close to 100% or higher? And then from there, you also have things like IDC and SCN tolerance listed there as well. So that's going to give you, you know, more information to help choose your varieties. Rotation, really important. Disease management, root rots, weed control, all those factors come into play when you're trying to determine your crop rotation. This is some data from MASC. You can find this online. Along the top here, what you'll see the crop planted, and along the side here on the previous crop. So when you're looking at crop planted, the crops that do well, if you're going on some of the cereals like spring wheat and winter wheat, oats is right around that 100% range. Canola is at 100% as well. The one that's interesting, I throw this one at the bottom here, it's 113%. Very small percentage of growers that do that. Soybeans and dry beans should never see the same rotation, if I had anything to say about it. Just because of the issues with volunteers in soybeans, that can be a real challenge moving forward if you have to incorporate dry beans to that rotation. Moving forward, when you're looking at how the crop planted looks at how soybeans perform there. Sorry, here you can. A little bit of a flicker here. You can see here again, cereals do well. Cereals will do very well on soybean ground as well, and that's why I try and incorporate cereals, canola, and you can spread out your rotation between soybeans. I like to see soybeans once every 3 years at minimum, because sometimes if you start cutting your rotation a little too close. When we first started growing soybeans out here, some growers would say, well, you know what, I heard that if you get better nodulation if you put soybeans back to back. The problem is that can set you up for a little bit of a false sense of security if you get away with it the first 2 years, because at some point there's going to be issues. One of the issues that I come across every so often is where a farmer planted soybeans in year 1, planted wheat in year 2, and decided to plant pinto beans in year 3. Soybeans will volunteer 2 years afterwards. The worst I've seen is upwards of 10% volunteering in dry beans, and that becomes a concern for not only dry beans but for peas, because soybeans are considered a food allergen in the dry bean industry, and that's why it's so important to watch those rotations. What's missing from those roots? Nodules. Nodulation sometimes gets taken for granted because we've been growing soybeans so often now, and most fields have had soybeans at least once on in the last few years, but every once in a while we come across a situation where you get poor nodulation, like in this particular picture here, where the top one here, just a couple of nodules. Here we're seeing more nodules. If you cut them open, they're nice and green inside. But this is what's happened in the past as well. This is from a few years ago. In this particular instance, the farmer thought he had inoculant on the soybeans. He thought it was ready to go, it was treated, and it turned out it wasn't. And he didn't realize that until about a week after planting. So what does the farmer do? He put 100 pounds of nitrogen on that field, right at seeding time. But he also let us experiment in that field as well. And what we found is where the farmer put no nitrogen down, the yield was 34.4 bushels an acre. Where the farmer had put 100 pounds of nitrogen down at seeding time, the yield, right at the bottom, 31.5. Statistically, no difference, right? So if you know you don't have inoculant down and you're concerned that it's a new field, don't put nitrogen on it. It's not going to give you any benefit. What you need to do is you need to consider a potential risk or a rescue treatment. And that rescue treatment, to quickly summarize, would be looking at early pod fill. Early pod fill, that's where we saw the yield bump at 39 bushels an acre at 50 pounds of nitrogen, and 100 pounds of nitrogen broadcast, we were looking at 41. If we were looking at putting on early flowering, even though that number is slightly higher, but statistically it's the same, no advantage to putting on an early flower. So again, still using that as a rescue treatment is kind of what we're kind of looking at, but getting good nodulation is meaning that using a granule and liquid inoculant if the field is relatively new to soybeans. If the soybeans have a bit of history, then what you want to be looking at is at least using a liquid. I myself still use a liquid, and some years I'll add a little bit of peat to have a little bit more, a better go of it. But I've been growing soybeans for a number of years. Have not noticed any nodulation issues. Soybeans versus navy beans. I throw this slide up here because this could be a challenge for growers if you're in an area that's a little bit wetter. If you're used to growing soybeans and you get a lot of moisture and you decide to grow navy beans on that same year, that's what's going to happen. So dry beans don't like that kind of condition. So again, making those decisions, if you're growing dry beans, pick the field that has good drainage. With soybeans, you get away with a lot more on the moisture side, but this was an interesting slide from a number of years ago. Farmer had navy beans on top of, or the south side of the field, and on the north side of the field had soybeans. Pretty distinctive in how this is after about 9 inches of rain. So, IDC, iron deficiency chlorosis, as my shirt indicates. It's a condition where the plant can take up iron. It has some challenges at that second to third trifoliate stage. What can you do about it? Well, first of all, additional iron doesn't really give you anything. Probably the biggest thing to really look at is, number one, fields with look at your carbonate and salt levels in the field. And you can get that information from your soil test. If your carbonates, are getting quite high and you're in that 5% range, and this particular soil test, my soluble salts are approaching 1, that puts me at a bit of higher risk for iron deficiency chlorosis. So that puts me, that puts me down in this category here. Well, what you can do though is when you're looking at the variety guide, you can pick varieties. Once you've picked your yield for a particular variety that you want to grow, then you start looking at IDC scores. Look at your field soil test. If your soil test is coming back at high levels of carbonates and salts, then what you need to do is you need to pick a variety that is considered tolerant. Now, the ratings that are in the guide, those are the ratings that I've been doing since 2011. So it's not the company ratings. The way it's done is we have a site close to Winnipeg and we rate each variety, that's one single variety here, each row. We rate those 3 times at each rating, so we have 3 replications there, and I come back 3 times over a 3-week period. So in the end, I have a total of 9 ratings, right? And you can see here, this is a susceptible line. You can see how they're short and stunted. So a susceptible line will have a score of 2.3 or higher. A tolerant line will have a score of 1.7 or lower. And anything that is in the middle, like this one here, this would be probably about a 2.1, give or take. It's starting to yellow a bit, but you still have good growth. So in the end, you can see something like this when I'm doing my scores. Tolerant lines typically stay green through the whole time period, right? With susceptible lines, you'll see these 2.4s come in when I'm doing my ratings. And what I'm trying to find is I want to see the varieties that are tolerant, and I want to see the varieties that are susceptible. And we are testing at a site that is quite prone to IDC. So if you were to take these varieties in your own field, and you had, high carbonates and salts, and you put a susceptible variety in there, what's going to happen is you're going to have a shorter plant, a stunted plant if you go through wet weather. They generally tend to grow out of it, but the susceptible plants are much worse. So it's really important when you're looking at that list to say, okay, well, which ones are susceptible? If I'm growing a variety, doesn't mean you shouldn't grow it. You just have to be more selective on which field you put it on. So here is a picture from back in 21 along the roadside, and you first think, well, there's some IDC happening in there. The problem is the IDC in this field never really disappeared. So they called us out to look at the field, and walked in, you can see, with our booties on and what have you, and walked in and dug up a plant, and what we see is a plant or a root that has all these little little bumps on them, all these cysts, lemon-shaped cysts on there. A nodule is quite a bit bigger. This is the first time that we've actually seen above ground symptoms on the plant in the last number of years. Most years, when Mario Chanu has been doing his research, he's been able to find cysts in the soil, but that's only after digging up the soil, taking it back to the lab. This is the first time in this instance here that we were able to see it in the field. And what happened here is there were a few things that were going on. This is a map of the actual field. Any of the red pockets here that you see here, those were what considered hot spots. So along the roadway here, that's where those earlier pictures were from. So in this particular instance, it was soybeans 1 and 4 years. The farmer was not growing a soybean cyst nematode variety. What also made things worse is in that 4-year rotation, they also had dry beans mixed in, which provides another host year for soybean cyst nematode. That made things worse. There was equipment brought in from other areas that potentially could have had SCN on it. And if you're doing that, make sure that equipment is clean before you put it in your field. The situation was made worse this particular year because it was a dry year, more stress on the plant, and those symptoms were showing up even more so. But moving forward, trying to incorporate those soybean cyst nematode varieties into your rotation will help you set up for success. Now, typically with SCN, you're going to find it more in the low areas. You're going to find it along fence lines. You're going to find it in depressions in the field, in the headlands, those types of things. But if you see something such as what you think is IDC through the season and it's not going away, call us in, have us get a look at it, because again, with those particular levels that were in that field, the egg levels were high enough that were causing above ground symptoms. So far, we've been pretty fortunate. We only have 5 RMs right now that have found SCN, and the arm of Thompson, that one particular field was the only one where soybean cyst nematode actually affected the above ground symptoms of the plant. So in the end, you know, I said cleaning equipment, stretching rotations out a bit, use of resistant varieties, all those things can be found in Seed Manitoba, but those are things to help pick your varieties. It helps you narrow down which varieties that you're actually wanting to grow. Now, here's a list of the susceptible crops. Peas happen to be included in that as well. And there are dry beans in that list, but there's also some weeds in there as well. So those are some of the things that I kind of look at or talk to growers about. Fortunately, I figured the more I talk about it, the less we're actually going to see it out in the field. But I think in the end, I think just being aware of what's out there. I'm going to finish off with a couple of slides. I can take credit for this picture in two ways. Number one, I can take credit because I took the picture. And the other thing I can take credit for is it was in my field. So this was back in 2020. This particular weed, this is tall water hemp. This was no competition in the bottom of the drain, growing from beginning of July to the end of September, in the middle of the field, right? So again, tall water hemp becoming more of a problem in Manitoba, and it's a weed that you need to be aware of. In this particular instance here, once I saw that weed was about 10 feet, about 10 feet tall, because it was above the swather, it was above the swather cab. And this plant would have had over 1 million seeds on it. With that being, and you can see here the bottom, the base of the stem, it's like a Christmas tree, right? When you're out scouting for water hemp or pigweeds, it's a pigweed, right? One of the things to really look at is whether or not the stem has hairs. When it's small or when it's big, water hemp is very, very smooth. Think of electrical wire, as smooth as electrical wire. If it's got hairs on it, more than likely it's pigweed. A lot of times you're going to see that these weeds start to show up in kind of early July, kind of after spraying. If you've used the extend or enlist system to try to help reduce the weed issues in that field, you're probably not going to see it in the field. But where you are going to see it is along headlands. You're going to see it wherever there's black ground, if there's water hemp in the area. There's 28 confirmed RMs right now that have water hemp. But, some of the things that you kind of look at moving forward, watch for potential problem areas, flooded ground, the weed seeds can move in, headlands of fields. Don't spray glyphosate alone on the first pass. And I think growers are getting the message when we talked about the extend varieties that we're growing, and the enlist varieties, growers are really starting to incorporate that into the rotation as well, trying to control those weeds when they're small. Scout the fields in July, August for some of these weeds. You're going to see them in any areas where there's black ground along headlands. And by all means, do not put those water hemp plants through the combine. If you want to spread it, that's what's going to happen if you put it through the combine. So those are some of the things that kind of keep a watch out for. And Kim Brown, our provincial weed specialist, has been doing meetings all for the last 2 years. I've been helping her out from time to time with different little projects. But again, it's something that you need to, when you find it in your field, don't be afraid to talk to your neighbor about it, because I think we all have to be watching for it, because if we find it and it's small enough populations, we go and we pull it, we get it off the field and destroy it. So it's not going to spread further. So with that being said, I might be over my 20 minutes, but I'm going to turn it back over to Lionel now. Gone? Yeah, no, for nodulation, probably the biggest thing I would tend to look at is using proper rhizobium bacteria, getting a good coverage on the seed so that you do get good nodulation. On wetter years, if you're using a liquid only and you don't have any history there, or very little history, you could see reduced nodulation in those areas. To me, just getting better coverage, and that's where the granular, because it's a different form, using a granular and liquid together will really ensure you get good nodulation, unless you've had a really long history there, and then nodulation becomes more natural in that instance.
Okay, and just a follow-up to that, what producer is asking me, is there any products like Tag Team or those being developed for soybeans or dry beans?
Tag Team is probably a very good inoculant. I think at the end of the day, the biggest thing to really look at is just making sure you're using a good supply of good, fresh inoculant. And most growers that, again, that's the one thing that's changed over the years. Like when I first got into the soybean industry and started growing my own, we would inoculate our own. Anybody growing peas and used to do the inoculation on the back of the truck and kind of remember some of that stuff we used to do. Nowadays, when you're picking up your soybean seed, some of it already comes pre-inoculated, and the rest of it is inoculated right at the plant. So they get really good coverage. So the biggest thing is getting good coverage, getting the seed into the ground as quick as you can to make those soybeans grow as quick as possible, and just checking for nodulation at that early flowering stage. Just make sure you have nodulation. One sign, if you have poor nodulations, you'll start to see some yellowing in the field. That field that I showed you earlier that had no history of soybeans in it, it did have 50 pounds of residual. Even there was no nodulation whatsoever in that field through the season. Even though the field still yielded reasonably well, like in the entire field yielded in that 35 to 40 bushel range, you can, if you don't have good nodulation, you don't maximize your yield potential.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. And
Thank you.
we'll have some more questions for you later on as we finish our next presenter. So our next presenter is Dr. John Gavloski, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that know John. John is the entomologist with Manitoba Agriculture, based out of Carmen. He conducts monitoring programs for some of the more common insect pests of the crops and provides information on insects, both beneficial and potential pests to farmers, agronomists, and those working in agriculture. John has a bachelor's degree in environmental biology and a master of science in entomology from the University of Guelph, and completed his PhD in the Department of Entomology at the University of Manitoba. John's been a member of Manitoba Ag for about 28 years now, so that's why I say that a lot of people here probably know him. So, John, if you want to take it away.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Lionel. So I'm going to skip right into this slide here. I'll give you a bit of an overview of what I'll be talking about. So I'm not going to cover all of these insects. My goal in this presentation really is to cover some of the highlights of what happened last year. And being a crop talk presentation, really what I want to focus in on is answering questions that you might have. So as I'm going through this, think of questions that you might have. So I'm going to cover a few of these. Lionel asked me also to speak at the end of my presentation on new insecticides that have come out. So I'll cover some of the insects off this list here, and then we'll talk insecticides at the very end. So this is my top 10 list, basically, of top 10 insects from 2024 in field crops. I've got three red arrows on my slide here. That's because these are things that are either new or slightly different from 2023. I think I presented a similar slide last year at the Crop Talk presentation. It looked almost the same, except we had diamondback moth instead of where I have Bertha armyworm. Grasshoppers were on the list both years, but they were a bit less of an issue in 2024. And aphids and small grains, same thing. They were on the list, but less of an issue this year than the previous year, and I'll go over why that might be. Now, before I get into the insect part of it, you're going to get about 2 minutes of meteorology, because a lot of what happens with our insect populations is influenced very heavily by weather conditions. So this first one here is temperatures in Agro-Manitoba in 2024 by month. So 0 would mean that's kind of your average. So anything below means cooler, anything above means warmer. And you can see how we started out. April was warmer than normal. We were at that point, at the end of April, thinking we could be in for a lot of early seeding, early plant growth. Things were looking pretty good. It was getting a little bit dry, though, in some areas. Then we hit May and June. Temperatures were, in all regions, were below normal. And then things got warmer in July, August, and we were above normal the rest of the summer. So have a good look at this, and I'm going to flip to the next one here. And this is our precipitation. And you can see, especially in May and June, it's almost the exact opposite of the previous one. So we had a bit above average moisture in April, May, well above average moisture in every region, and in June, same thing, we were above average in every region, not to the same extent, but still, we're getting lots of rain, and we had some big heavy rainfalls in June, which does impact your insect populations. And then you can see what happened. We were mainly below normal for the rest of the season in precipitation. So we had all this rain early on, and then it became dry and hot later on. And that does affect our insects. So the first one I'm going to cover is grasshoppers. I'm just going to cover it briefly. If anyone's around Thursday morning at around 11 here, we'll be doing a deep dive into the impact of weather on insects, and we're going to cover 4 different ways that weather will impact grasshopper populations. I'm just going to cover 1 or 2 of them. So last year we did have some spraying for grasshoppers. Mainly in the central region, but not nearly the same extent as in 2023. The grasshopper levels in general were lighter. Not to the point where there was no issues. There were certainly some issues still, but not to the same extent as the previous year. Now, if we go back to those weather slides, we had well above average moisture in May and June. Just at the time the grasshoppers were hatching out, we were getting a lot of rain. So when a grasshopper hatches out, they are tiny. They're about the size of a wheat kernel when they hatch out. They're small little grasshoppers, and they don't have much fat reserves built up. They have to feed right away, get those fat reserves built up, and then they're going to be a healthy, happy grasshopper. If they can't do that, there's going to be more mortality in the population, and that's what happened this year. We had our populations probably reduced somewhat in some areas because of some of that moisture early on. Now, we do a grasshopper survey every year. In August, we go and we do counts along field edges. We did 107 sites this year, and we always put together this map. So anything green on the map is a lighter risk, and even yellow is considered light risk. When you get into this darker yellow color, that's more of a moderate risk, and orange is, we call it severe, but don't get too freaked out because sometimes we have areas that say severe and it doesn't end up being as bad as we predict. Now, you'll notice, first of all, on the map, lots of green here. Lots and lots and lots of green, which might make you think we probably don't have to worry about grasshoppers next year, right? Because levels were down last year, and we've got a lot of green on our map. But if you remember, back to our weather graphs again, August and September, less than normal moisture, and above average temperatures. In fact, September in pretty much every region was at least 5 degrees above normal for temperatures. Really warm conditions in September, and our first widespread frost was October 3rd. So the grasshoppers that were present had a good opportunity to lay their maximum number of eggs. One of the things that makes our pest species is, given good conditions, they can lay a lot of eggs. Plus, they like the crops that we grow. So that's what separates out our pest grasshoppers from the many grasshoppers that we consider to be non-pest. In fact, Manitoba, we've got about 85 different species of grasshoppers. There's 4 we consider to be pest species. So the ones that are pests, given good conditions, they can build their populations up. So if you're, say, farming up in the Dauphin area, or say down around Carmen, where I'm from, don't be too complacent. Even though the map shows green in your area, we had really good egg-laying conditions, so things can bounce back quickly if they get the right weather conditions. So cutworms. So cutworms are another group of insects with different species. They feed differently. And in general, though, they go through these cycles where they tend to build up and they get bad for a few years. They peak and then they sort of tail off a little bit. And the last 2 or 3 years, we've we reached our peak in around 2019, 2020, and we've been going down the other side ever since. So last year we did have some cutworm issues. There was some spraying and even a little bit of reseeding. But when you compare it to 2019, 2020, it wasn't nearly to the same extent. So going into next year, cutworms are certainly still something to be watching for. There probably will be some fields where they are of issue, but we're not dealing with the levels that we had back in 2019 and 2020. And these are the two species here that have been dominant over our last cycle. Dingy cutworm, and over here it's redback cutworm with the red stripes down the back. You might think a cutworm's a cutworm, right? Shouldn't matter. They do feed a bit differently. We have different groupings for cutworms. One of our groupings is something called climbing cutworms. So species that come out of the soil, chomp away in the evening, go back in the soil, but don't really cut the plants. And when you're scouting the next day, you see defoliation to the plants, but you don't see any insects, and you don't see any clipped plants, which can be kind of deceiving. You're not thinking cutworm. Dig around, see if it's potentially something like dingy cutworm. Redback cutworm, they belong to a group, we call them the surface feeding cutworms. So they come out of the soil, and they're crawling along the soil, and they're feeding at the soil level, so they're cutting the plants, and they'll feed on them on the ground. So when you're scouting the next day, there's a plant lying on the ground that obviously has been clipped, and you recognize that more as cutworm feeding. So there are differences depending on the species in how they will feed. I mentioned we did have some reseeding, and I did have an interesting situation where an agronomist called me up and said that one of their fields, it was a canola field, and they had a diamide insecticide seed treatment on the seed. So diamides, that's your group that includes things like Fortenza and Lumiderm and those products. So they had one of these insecticides that's supposed to kill the cutworms. It didn't really work all that well. And in this case, they were going to reseed it back to canola. And the question for me, of course, is what's going on here? Are we getting resistance? And my gut feeling is no. Again, remember back to the weather. We had a lot of rain in May and June, and these seed treatments are water soluble, so meaning they're going to be leaching off the seed into the soil. So when you get excess moisture repeatedly like that, it will shorten the length of the seed treatment. So my speculation in this case is that because of the abundance of rainfall in that area, they probably just had reduced activity of their seed treatment. So canola insects, I'm just going to cover a couple other ones. We've already covered cutworms. Flea beetles is the biggie. We've had chronic flea beetle populations for a long time here. And really, what makes the big difference is how quickly your plants can get from the day you seed to the 3 to 4 leaf stage. The flea beetles, for the last, I'll say, almost couple decades, the flea beetles have been there in numbers that they can do significant damage. But the real challenge is getting the plants to that 3 to 4 leaf stage quickly. And we got off to a good start in the sense that we had good soil moisture, but it got so cool and cold, actually, in late May and June. A lot of fields, the plants had come up and they just sat in that seedling stage to the point where the seed treatments wore off and people were doing foliar sprays and reseeding in a few cases. So very weather dependent, and all I can give you as far as tips and pointers is anything you can do to try to get that quick early season growth is going to help you reduce your risk of flea beetles. But that is hard to do because you can't predict far enough what the weather is going to do. If you're interested in more information on flea beetles, their biology, management, scouting, we have a fairly revised fact sheet. It was revised in November 2023, and I'll probably update it this spring again because there's some new chemistry. one of the things that we added to the fact sheet was this scouting guide. Because one of the things that's really tricky with flea beetles is knowing what's a good time to apply a foliar insecticide. How much feeding is too much? When do we pull the trigger? So the upper row here, there's definitely feeding on these plants. But these plants are probably, for the most part, well, it gives you the numbers here, they're in that 13 to 16% feeding damage. The reason we can be so accurate here is because someone actually used image analysis equipment, and they were able to, because of the contrasting green and brown patterns, figure out the exact percentage. So these are under 20%. The threshold is about 25%. So the middle row here, that's the point where you probably should be considering a foliar spray. If you're at this point and the flea beetle population is thick and you still got a ways to go to get to that 3 to 4 leaf stage. And certainly if you're above 25% and the flea beetles are heavy, you need to act really quick. If things don't get any worse than that top row, the plants will outgrow that damage. So you just have to keep an eye on things. And lygus bugs. Now I'm showing them on canola here and sunflowers on the far side. Lygus bugs are a sap-feeding insect that feeds on many things. They've got a beak like a mosquito. They inject some saliva in the plant, soften up an area, and suck out the juice. They like to feed on the upper, newer, high-protein growth, so buds, flowers, young seeds. When the seeds firm up, they can't really feed anymore. So this lygus bug here would be puncturing the pod, trying to feed on the seed underneath. We did have some fairly high levels last year. There was some spraying, particularly the eastern region, the area around Niverville and south of and around that area. There was some heavier lygus bug populations. Again, they're a pest of many crops, so not just canola. People know them well in canola, but sunflowers, confection sunflowers, dry beans, alfalfa seed, faba beans. There's many crops where they can be an economic issue. Small grain cereals, we've already covered cutworms and grasshoppers, so I'm going to touch on armyworms and aphids. And the armyworm that I'm going to talk about isn't Bertha armyworm. In this case, we will call it either just armyworm or sometimes true armyworm or cereal armyworm. This is the adult moth. They do not overwinter in the prairies. They migrate in, and it's actually a purposeful migration. They're not just randomly getting blown on winds. They're migrating, but they do get picked up on wind currents and deposited in areas. When they arrive, they are looking for a dense grassy stand to lay their eggs into. So Manitoba, that's often a winter wheat field, a fall rye field, forage grasses. They tend to have the heaviest damage. It's the larvae that do all the damage. They will feed on the plants and do a lot of defoliation. So we had a population that blew in, but seemed to get deposited in the eastern interlake and the eastern part of the central region. The western part of the province, I'm not aware of any issues. It was mainly an eastern issue, and that's because of where the eggs all got laid. We do pheromone trapping for armyworms. It didn't show the results today just because of time, but if you're interested in the spring, we do have results from our pheromone monitoring that we can share with you. We do have an updated fact sheet on armyworms, so again, if you're looking for further information, check that out. Aphids on small grains. So the aphids that we were dealing with, we had a couple of species. English grain aphids. Here's a bigger picture of one, big black cornicles sticking out of it. They like to get right into the head of the plant, and they tuck themselves right in among the kernels, so you have to almost bend the head a little bit to see them in there. They can be really tricky to scout for. The other one that we had was the oak bird cherry aphid. You can see a little rusty saddle on the back of this one, but they are a very small aphid. They're the one that's a good vector of barley yellow dwarf. So we had both species present. We did have some spraying for them this year, not nearly as much as in 2023 though, but some farmers were spraying for them. One of the problems that we have though is we've got 2 active ingredients registered for aphids and cereals, malathion and dimethoate. Dimethoate has a 35-day pre-harvest interval. So in 2024, the aphids got bad in July, and it was often mid and late July when people were spraying or needed to spray for their aphids. Problem is, 35-day pre-harvest, there's no way you're going to be waiting 35 days before you harvest the crop when you're spraying that early. So for a lot of people, dimethoate wasn't an option. Malathion wasn't all that available, so a lot of people couldn't get that one, which means, what do? So people were having to use products registered for other insects in cereals. So if there's any company reps out there, we really need more chemistries registered for aphids and cereals, particularly some of the more selective products, things that kill just aphids and not the beneficials. One of the other issues we got into last year, some of the people, while they were scouting for the aphids, were seeing a lot of lady beetles, a lot of hoverfly larvae, which look like little slugs, a lot of lacewings and lacewing larvae. And their dilemma was, we've got beneficials in our field, but we've got aphids at threshold. What do we do? And it's a tricky one. If you have a selective insecticide, that could be an option. Some people did just let it play itself out and told me that over time the aphids did come down. So for some of them that worked out. And if you need more information on aphids and cereals, we do have a fairly updated fact sheet on that as well. So go to the website and there'll be more information. So I'm going to wrap up by just talking about a couple insects in pulse crops, pea aphid and soybean aphid. Lots we've already covered. So aphids once again. So not all aphids are created equally, so I'm going to cover 2 aphids that are very different in the way they feed and in thresholds. So aphids and peas. The dominant aphid, pretty much the sole one that most people will see scouting peas, is pea aphid. And pea aphids, just like lygus bugs, they like that upper growth. So when they're on your pea plants, they're usually at the top. If there's a bud, a flower, or a young pod, that's where they're feeding. Where they're economical is when you have a developing pod that's just started to develop. If there's aphids feeding on that, they're competing for the phloem that's trying to fill those seeds. And that's when they can be really economical in peas. So at peas, we encourage people, get out there in the flowering stage, scout for aphids, and as soon as you see the young pods developing, if you're above our thresholds, which are quite low, then it pays to spray. And it is quite low. If you're shaking plants, it's really just 2 or 3 aphids per plant tip. And if you're doing the sweep net sampling, 9 to 12 per sweep, or 90 to 120 in 10 sweeps. So fairly low thresholds for aphids and peas. Now aphids and soybeans, very different aphid. They colonize the plant very differently. Instead of clustering at the top, they will spread themselves out quite a bit more. And the thresholds are a lot higher in soybeans, 250 per plant on average, and the population is still increasing is the threshold we use in soybeans. And hopefully everybody knows what this is. This is a lady beetle larva. So this is Asian lady beetle, that's the larva stage. Young lady beetles look like little mini alligators, and some of the fields people were seeing a lot of predators in the soybean fields as well. So one of the dilemmas people got into, there was some spraying that happened this year, particularly in the eastern region. And I did get a couple calls from farmers because they were seeing a lot of the natural enemies, but they were around that threshold. What do I do? They had been trying to find a product that is an aphicide, kills only aphids. They wanted to use that, but they couldn't find it, so they ended up using pyrethroids instead, and the pyrethroids weren't always giving them good control. I think we do have a little bit of pyrethroid resistance developing. I did do a test tube test to try to figure it out. And there was a few flaws with our testing, but there was some good evidence that we do have pyrethroid resistance developing in some of our soybean aphid populations. Now I say developing, really what happens is we inherit the problems of some of the northern states. Soybean aphid, as far as we know, doesn't overwinter here. It gets blown in. But in states like Minnesota, North Dakota, Iowa, they've been battling pyrethroid resistance for quite a while in the soybeans. And in 2 different years now, when we've tested in Manitoba, we have conclusively in 1 year found pyrethroid resistance. And last year, like I said, some of the test tubes had too much liquid in them. It's hard to interpret my results, but there was a hint of resistance last year as well. So I promised I would cover insecticides before I wrapped up. Not much to report. The top product here is Shenzi, chlorantraniliprole, big word. Chlorantraniliprole is your Coragen. So Coragen Max. We now have generic versions, Shenzi, so the patent has expired with Coragen. We now have a generic version, which probably means the price you pay for Coragen will probably come down next year, which is probably good news. Rama and Decimate, so those are generic versions of a chemical called daltemethrine. You probably best know it as Desis. So a couple more generic versions of Desis, which has been around for a long time. And one that I didn't put on my list that came out quite recently, for anybody who's been battling alfalfa weevil, there's a product, it's not a new product, it's called a sale, it's a neonicotinoid. They've added alfalfa weevil and alfalfa to their label. So that's something new. So that might be good news for anybody who's been battling alfalfa weevil. I'll just mention that Crop Talk is a great forum for getting your questions answered over the growing season. We also produce a Manitoba crop pest update during the growing season. And what we try to do is we try to collect data from farmers and agronomists on a weekly basis. And then we compile that and we put out a report basically summarizing what's been happening with insects, weeds, and diseases over the past week. So if anybody's interested in that and you're not on our email notification list, let me know. We'll add you to the list. We would send you an email every week letting you know when we post a new Manitoba crop pest update. So I'll wrap up with that and we can move into questions.
Okay, we're going to go right into questions. So I'm going to ask all the panelists to come up to the front. So it's kind of a bit of an example of what we do with Crop Talk on a weekly basis, and I think I threw a bunch of slides. Is there questions from the crowd? Because that's one of the things we would like to take right away, if there's any questions. Okay, well, if you've got a question, just shout out. I'm going to go with some of the slides that we prepared, and these are just some things that would come in on a weekly basis to myself or to other people working. And this one will be for John Gavloski. There's those notches in the pea leaf there. If you could let us know what that is.
Okay, so have a look at this. Very distinct notching happening here. So this is from a small weevil. Weevils are types of beetle. They're called the pea leaf weevil. And the beetle that did these notches really is not of any harm, but their larva can be. So the beetle again is making little notches, but those notches, no big deal. But they lay their eggs and they have a very, very tiny white larva that feeds on the nodules of pea plants, not the roots, the nodules. So the nodules are the things that have the rhizobium that produce the nitrogen for the plant. So if you get too much feeding from pea leaf weevil, you've got plants with very reduced nodules, and the plants can't fix nitrogen like they should. So then you get nitrogen deficiency in your peas because you probably haven't been putting a lot of nitrogen down. So that's really the big issue with pea leaf weevil, is you end up with nitrogen deficiency in your peas. Foliar insecticides do not work that well. Seed treatments work better. They're not, I wouldn't say it's great control, but it's better than the foliar sprays. So We do have some hot spots in the province. That area around Dauphin, the area around Roblin, Russell in the northwest, we've been seeing quite a bit of pea leaf weevil activity, and it's moving south a little bit. So people who have had a history of some of this in their fields, using a seed treatment early in the season is right now the best we can recommend as far as management goes.
Okay, thanks, John. I'm going to skip through a couple slides here,
Oh, those are cool.
and maybe I'll get you to talk about this one, John.
Yeah, this is really cool. So have a look at these. Red things on the back of the grasshoppers. So these aren't eggs. These are mites. They're called red velvet mites, and they're parasites of grasshoppers, so they're kind of caked underneath the wing buds. That's often where you see them. Sometimes you just see a couple, sometimes you'll see a cluster of up to about a dozen. And they're feeding on the insect blood. We call it hemolymph in insects. It's the insect blood. That's what they're feeding on. They don't always kill a grasshopper, but they can weaken them when you get big numbers like that. So they are a parasite of grasshoppers. Early in different stages of their life, they can be either predator or parasitoid of different insects. But on grasshoppers, they work like a parasite. And again, they will weaken them, and there's been some studies that show when there's enough feeding, they will lay fewer eggs. So they're a good guy.
Okay, thanks, John.
That's cool too.
These all came in one order for me here. Just I'm going to flip over to there. Here's one for Sonia. Seen this in canola fields the past couple years. You want to describe what's happening to those pods?
Yeah, so, and again, this kind of ties into that map I showed you of the days that were over 28 degrees. So we get a lot of questions here, later in the season, is this like a nitrogen fertility issue? Because you associate that purple with it. But really what the key thing is here is if you're seeing pods, make sure that you're looking and turning them over, because this actually is usually often, especially in that July period, sun scalding, right? So you'll have that purpling, which is really damaged from the sun, just on the top of the pods, and then you'll see on the other half, right, they're still green because they're not in contact with the sun. So we definitely saw a lot of this year.
Hey, thanks,
Yeah.
Sonia. Another one for you, Sonia.
Yeah. Yeah, so Lionel sent this in, and just seeing on harvested equipment some of this kind of powdery substance, etc. This is really coming from either it can be from powdery mildew, sooty molds, and you'll see it on your harvest equipment right as you go through the plants, especially if you've left them potentially to straight cut and they've had more time in the field. There will be some of that moves in, but again, it's not so much of a yield concern because again, you're just going in there to harvest, and we just see it depending on weather conditions as well. Yeah.
I'm just flipping through here to get to one for Dennis. Here you go, Dennis.
Alrighty, so what we're looking at in here is a little bit of bacterial blight in here on those leaves. It hasn't been a major issue, but with the bacterial blight, you can see that yellow halo kind of around the soybean leaves. A lot of times with bacterial blight, it's going to move in typically after some kind of weather event, wind, hail. Usually within 10 to 14 days, you start to see this happen a bit in soybeans and in dry beans, of course. But also what can happen is where you typically see this is in the mid to upper canopy. If you're seeing something different in the lower canopy, that's probably Septoria brown spot. Septoria brown spot doesn't have that brown halo around it, but that's typically what you're seeing. Really nothing you can do about it, just kind of walk away. The plants typically grow out of it, so, and because it's the bacteria, there's nothing you can really spray for it anyway, so. Yeah, this is a very similar situation here, and it can look a little different, but you look for that yellow halo around it, and that's still more a bacterial blight. If you go to the next slide here as well, Lionel, kind of the same thing. That yellow halo is all bacterial. So somebody will see this in the field, and they're like, what's going on? What was sprayed on that field? Well, in this case here, this is more what's called rapid growth syndrome. Usually if you've had cool nights and warm days, you see that plants start to stretch, and this is what's called rapid growth symptom, nothing to be real concerned about.
And one more for you, Dennis.
And this would be a little bit of white mold that you're seeing in the plant, right down in here. Same pathogen as what you'd have in canola. We've seen more white mold this year in the August period in some fields that were really dense canopy. But looking back over the years, one of the worst years we had for white mold in soybeans was 2013. 2013 is when we actually broke a record for 1 million acres in Manitoba. And 2013, at the time, we actually broke a record for yield at 39 bushels an acre. So a little bit of white mold, no gold, sometimes is what they say. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's, a yield loss, but again, you need upwards of 10% white mold in your field to show yield loss, and 10% would mean 14,000 plants out of the 140. So that's pretty significant. 2013, we did see higher levels, but nothing that really affected yields widespread. So.
Okay, and for time-wise, I think we're going to probably have to end it there. I did have a few more, just some examples of some of the stuff that we get on a weekly basis that we talk about on Crop Talk. So if you're interested in Crop Talk, there's a QR code there if you want to register for this coming year. It'll be available, so definitely attend. Like I mentioned, we do this on a weekly basis during the growing season. We have our specialists with us that give their time to answer your questions as we go through, and there's also CCA credits available, so if you are a member of CCA and want credits, usually there's 1 or 2 credits per week available for it as well. So I'd like to thank our specialists for coming out here and kind of giving you a live example of what we do on our weekly webinars. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for attending.